Breaking news out of Ottawa. Canada's new Prime Minister Mark Carney has just pulled the plug on a $1 5 trillion space cooperation agreement with the United States. And in a move that sent shockwaves through Washington, he's handing exclusive access to China instead. We're talking about the complete restructuring of North American space infrastructure, satellite networks that handle everything from your GPS to military communications and research facilities that took 4 decades to build. In the next 11 minutes, I'm going to break down exactly who signed this deal, what technologies China is gaining access to, and why American defense officials are calling this the biggest strategic loss since the Panama Canal. Here's the question nobody in Washington wants to answer. What happens when your closest ally decides your biggest rival is a better partner? Let me paint you the picture. On January 18, 2025, just 72 hours after his inauguration, Prime Minister Mark Carney met with Chinese Vice Premier Ding Xuexiang in a closed-door session at 24 Sussex Drive. According to documents obtained by the Peterson Institute for International Economics, that meeting produced a memorandum of understanding that effectively terminated the North American Space Infrastructure Agreement, a framework established in 1984 and renewed every decade since. On January 20th, the Canadian Space Agency released a joint statement with the China National Space Administration announcing a comprehensive partnership valued at $1. 5 trillion over 15 years. The agreement grants China primary access to Canada's Arctic satellite ground stations, joint operation of the RadarSat constellation, and collaborative development of lunar mining technologies. By January 22nd, the Federal Reserve had convened an emergency session to assess the national security implications, while the Yale Budget Lab published preliminary analysis showing the potential cost to American space operations could exceed $890 billion in lost collaboration and $340 billion in new infrastructure requirements. On January 23rd, at 3:47 p.m. Eastern Time, the White House released a terse statement calling Carney's decision a fundamental breach of continental security cooperation. So how exactly does this work? Think of it like this. Imagine you and your neighbor have shared a security system for 40 years. You both paid for the cameras, you both monitor the feeds, and you've built your entire home security strategy around this cooperation. Now your neighbor decides to give the password to someone you've been warning them about for years, someone who's been trying to figure out your security setup, and on top of that, they're letting that person install their own cameras pointing at your property. That's essentially what's happening here. The North American Space Infrastructure Agreement wasn't just about satellites floating in orbit. According to the Aerospace Industries Association, it's an integrated network of 17 ground stations across Canada's Arctic region, 12 of which provide critical early warning data for NORAD, the joint US-Canada Aerospace Defense System. It includes shared access to synthetic aperture radar technology that can see through clouds and darkness, tracking everything from Russian submarines under Arctic ice to Chinese naval movements in the Pacific. The RadarSat constellation alone, which cost $1, $2 billion to develop and deploy, provides surveillance coverage that American military planners have relied on for 2 decades. Under Carney's agreement with China, the China National Space Administration gains what defense analysts call co-primary status, meaning Chinese engineers and technicians will have direct access to the same data streams, the same ground stations, and the same technological specifications that American defense systems depend on. The Center for Strategic and International Studies released a technical assessment on January 22nd showing that this access eliminates virtually every strategic advantage the United States maintained in Arctic surveillance and satellite reconnaissance over China. Meet Colonel Jennifer Hartwell, a 48-year-old satellite communications officer at Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado Springs. For the past 14 years, Jennifer has coordinated Arctic surveillance operations that rely on Canadian ground stations to track intercontinental ballistic missile trajectories. She wakes up on January 21st to an encrypted message informing her that 3 of her primary data feeds will be temporarily interrupted for partnership transition. Jennifer's job is to maintain continuous surveillance coverage. But here's her impossible choice. She can either maintain gaps in coverage that could miss critical threats, or she can request emergency authorization to launch replacement satellites at a cost her budget never anticipated. According to her testimony to the House Armed Services Committee on January 23rd, those gaps represent windows of up to 47 minutes where the United States has zero visibility over Arctic flight paths. Her team runs the calculations. Launching replacement satellites to fill those gaps will cost $340 million per unit, and they need at least 4 to maintain continuous coverage. Her annual budget is $180 million. Jennifer tells the committee that for the first time in her career, she cannot guarantee American security in the Arctic airspace. Meet Dr. Robert Chen, a 62-year-old atmospheric scientist at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in Boulder, Colorado. Robert's entire climate modeling system depends on synthetic aperture radar data from the RadarSat constellation to track Arctic ice melt and ocean current changes. On January 22nd, he receives notification that his data access will be restructured under new partnership protocols. His research, which informs everything from hurricane prediction models to agricultural planning across the Midwest, suddenly faces interruptions he cannot predict or control. Robert's impossible choice: continue publishing climate forecasts with incomplete data that could misinform millions of Americans about severe weather events, or suspend publications and lose $47 million in federal research grants that fund his entire team of 38 scientists. According to the Yale Budget Lab analysis released January 23rd, Robert's situation is replicated across 47 different federal research programs, affecting 2,300 scientists and $8 billion in annual research funding. Robert makes his choice. On January 24th, he submits a letter to NOAA leadership suspending all long-term climate projections until data reliability can be re-established. His team begins the process of shutting down models that have run continuously since 2006. Meet Sarah Blackstone, a 54-year-old logistics coordinator for commercial aviation at the Federal Aviation Administration headquarters in Washington. Sarah's job is to ensure that GPS augmentation systems, which make civilian air travel safe in poor weather conditions, operate with perfect reliability. These systems depend on ground reference stations across Canada's north to correct GPS signals that get distorted by magnetic interference near the poles. On January 21st, Sarah receives a technical briefing explaining that under the new Canada-China agreement, Chinese technicians will have access to calibration systems that could theoretically introduce subtle errors into GPS corrections. Her impossible choice: continue certifying these systems as safe based on trust that Chinese engineers won't manipulate them, or ground hundreds of flights daily that depend on precision GPS approaches in Alaska, northern Canada, and transpolar routes between North America and Asia. The Federal Aviation Administration calculates the cost of alternative routing for affected flights at $7 million per day, $985 million per year. Sarah makes her recommendation on January 23rd. Implement alternative navigation systems at a one-time cost of $340 million and ongoing annual costs of $120 million. The airline industry responds within hours, warning that these costs will translate to ticket price increases of 8 to 12% on affected routes, pricing millions of Americans out of air travel to Alaska and northern destinations. Multiply Sarah's choice by every federal agency that depends on Canadian space infrastructure, and you begin to understand the scale of disruption we're facing. According to the Aerospace Industries Association report published January 23rd, the immediate operational impact hits 23 different military and civilian systems. The RAND Corporation released analysis the same day projecting that replacing Canadian space cooperation will require $89 billion in new infrastructure over the next 8 years. But here's what really concerns analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. China gains direct intelligence on every aspect of American space-based defense systems, from satellite encryption protocols to ground station vulnerabilities to the precise orbits and capabilities of classified reconnaissance satellites. Dr. Michael Stevens at the Atlantic Council testified to the Senate Intelligence Committee on January 24th that this represents the most comprehensive intelligence loss in the space domain since the Cold War. The Peterson Institute for International Economics projects that American companies will lose $47 billion in commercial space contracts as international partners question the reliability of US-led space cooperation. And it gets worse. According to defense officials speaking to the Council on Foreign Relations, the agreement gives China access to lunar mining research that American aerospace companies have invested $12 billion developing over the past decade, essentially handing Beijing a blueprint for establishing the first permanent resource extraction operations on the moon. Experts warn that the consequences unfold in three devastating waves. In the next 30 to 90 days, according to the Federal Reserve assessment, American military and intelligence operations face immediate coverage gaps and data reliability issues that degrade operational readiness across Arctic and Pacific theaters. Defense contractors scramble to design replacement systems, but the Center for a New American Security projects that fast-track development will cost 47% more than planned programs, money that has to come from somewhere else in already stretched defense budgets. In 6 to 12 months, as Chinese engineers integrate themselves into Canadian space operations, the National Security Council warns that Beijing gains comprehensive understanding of Western satellite vulnerabilities, information that could prove decisive in any future conflict. Commercial space companies begin relocating operations to countries with more stable partnership frameworks, taking high-paying jobs and cutting-edge research with them. But here's what really concerns analysts at the Stimson Center: the permanent damage to alliance structures that took 7 decades to build. According to former NATO commanders speaking to the Atlantic Council, Carney's decision signals to American allies worldwide that partnership with Washington comes with enough instability and unpredictability that even Canada, the closest ally the United States has ever had, sees better options elsewhere. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace projects that this perception shift could unravel defense cooperation agreements worth $340 billion across NATO, Asian allies, and Latin American partners. And it gets worse. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology Review published analysis on January 24th showing that China's access to Arctic ground stations eliminates the 10-minute advantage American missile defense systems maintained in detecting launches from Russia or North Korea. That 10 minutes, according to former Defense Secretary testimony, represented the difference between intercepting threats over the ocean versus overpopulated areas. The University of Southern California Security and Political Economy Lab calculates that compensating for this loss requires deploying 6 additional Aegis missile defense ships at $1 billion each, plus $470 million annually in operational costs. But here's the kicker. Even with those deployments, according to the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, the United States cannot fully replicate the coverage Canadian ground stations provided. Some threats that were visible become invisible. Some response times that were adequate become inadequate. The math simply doesn't work anymore. Let me be crystal clear about what the data shows. According to the Congressional Research Service report released January 24th, this agreement represents the single largest voluntary transfer of strategic space assets from a Western ally to China in history. The Georgetown Security Studies Review calculates that China's space program just leaped forward by approximately 7 years in capabilities it would have taken them until 2032 to develop independently. And it gets worse. The Wilson Center published analysis showing that this deal fundamentally alters the power balance in what strategists call the ultimate high ground. For 40 years, the United States and its allies maintained overwhelming advantage in space-based intelligence, communications, and positioning systems. According to the Brookings Institution, Carney's agreement with China doesn't just narrow that advantage, it eliminates it in critical domains. Beijing now has the same access to Arctic surveillance that Washington spent $47 billion building over 4 decades. Chinese engineers now study the same satellite designs, the same ground station configurations, the same data processing systems that gave American forces unmatched battlefield awareness from Desert Storm through Ukraine. Let me be crystal clear about something else. According to trade data from the U.S. International Trade Commission, Canada remains America's largest trading partner, with $718 billion in annual bilateral trade. The Council on Foreign Relations projects that any American retaliation against Carney's space deal risks triggering a trade war that could cost both countries $290 billion in GDP over 5 years. So Washington faces an impossible strategic dilemma. Accept the loss of space cooperation that defense officials call unacceptable, or risk economic consequences that Treasury officials call catastrophic. Prime Minister Carney, according to interviews with Canadian policy analysts at the University of Toronto, is betting that this calculation paralyzes American response, giving China time to embed itself so deeply into Canadian space operations that reversing the arrangement becomes technically impossible. The timeline matters here. According to the China National Space Administration announcement, Chinese technicians begin arriving at Canadian ground stations on February 1st, just 9 days from now. The Atlantic Council warns that once Chinese engineers access these facilities, every encryption key, every satellite specification, every operational protocol becomes compromised from an American security perspective. The systems cannot be uncompromised. The knowledge cannot be unshared. Former CIA officials speaking to the Council on Foreign Relations describe it as ringing a bell you cannot unring. And here's what keeps defense planners awake. According to the National Defense University, China's access to these systems doesn't just help Beijing's space program, it helps their entire military modernization effort. Satellite reconnaissance data informs naval deployments. GPS augmentation systems guide precision weapons. Communications networks enable coordinated operations. By handing China co-primary access to Canadian space infrastructure, according to testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee, Carney has given Beijing a comprehensive view into how American forces operate, communicate, and coordinate across the domains that matter most in modern warfare. Let's recap the 3 critical points. First, WHO pays for this massive shift in space cooperation. American taxpayers face $89 billion in new infrastructure costs according to Rand Corporation analysis. Commercial space companies lose $47 billion in contracts according to the Peterson Institute, and defense budgets absorb $340 million in emergency satellite launches plus $470 million in annual operational costs that have to come from programs already struggling with shortfalls. Military families like Colonel Jennifer Hartwell's face security gaps that didn't exist 72 hours ago. Scientific teams like Dr. Robert Chen's lose research capabilities that took decades to build. Commercial aviation coordinators like Sarah Blackstone choose between safety and cost, between reliability and affordability, between American space independence and economic reality. Second, the scale with numbers that should alarm every American. According to the Federal Reserve, this represents a $5 trillion transfer of space cooperation from the United States to China. The Aerospace Industries Association counts 23 different military and civilian systems immediately affected. The Yale Budget Lab projects $8 billion in compromised federal research. The Congressional Research Service calls it the largest voluntary strategic asset transfer in modern history. Third, the permanent consequence that changes everything. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Carnegie Endowment, and the Atlantic Council, America's closest ally just signaled that partnership with Washington carries more risk than partnership with Beijing. That perception, once established, doesn't reverse when administrations change or policies shift. It becomes the new baseline for how allies calculate their interests. If this analysis helped you understand what's really happening with Canada's stunning pivot toward China in space cooperation, please hit that like button and subscribe for daily breakdowns of the geopolitical shifts reshaping our world. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand why American defense officials are calling this a strategic catastrophe. Here's what keeps me up at night. For 70 years, American security strategy rested on the assumption that Canada would always be there, that the longest undefended border in the world stayed undefended because both sides trusted each other completely, that space cooperation represented a bond so fundamental it transcended political differences. In 72 hours, Prime Minister Mark Carney shattered that assumption. And according to every expert I've consulted, every institution I've researched, every analysis I've read, nobody in Washington saw it coming, nobody has a plan to fix it, and nobody can guarantee it won't happen again, with other allies who are watching very carefully how America responds to the neighbor who just handed the house keys to their biggest rival.